Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. Because nothing says authentic storytelling quite like begging for engagement metrics before I've even told you why my family imploded. Marvelous. Right, where was I? Oh yes, the bit where everything went spectacularly tits up. I'm Marcus Ashford, 35 years old, marine ecologist by trade, family disappointment by default. Spent the better part of a decade studying ocean ecosystems, which apparently translates to unemployed weirdo who plays with fish in my family's rather limited vocabulary. My grandparents, bless their souls, the only decent people in this gene pool, left me their waterfront cottage bordering Olympic National Park in Washington State. It's been my anchor between research expeditions, my sanctuary, and, as it turns out, the catalyst for the most spectacular family meltdown since Aunt Geraldine got drunk at Christmas and told everyone what she really thought about Dad's toupee. After 18 months away in Maine tracking coastal erosion, riveting stuff, truly, nothing says living your best life like watching cliffs crumble in slow motion, I returned to Seattle for what I naively assumed would be a pleasant family dinner. How delightfully wrong I was. Picture the scene. Sunday roast, overcooked vegetables, that peculiar tension that only British families can manufacture out of thin air, even whilst living in the Pacific Northwest. My brother James, 38, real estate developer, personality of a particularly aggressive parking ticket, stood up mid-dessert with a grin that could only mean someone was about to get metaphorically stabbed. The house has sold for $500,000, he announced, as though he'd just cured cancer rather than committed what I can only describe as spectacularly creative fraud. The family erupted in applause. Actual applause. As if my brother had performed a particularly difficult magic trick rather than attempted to steal my bloody property. They called it brilliant business acumen. I called it theft. But apparently, I'm the difficult one. How dare you? I managed, my voice remarkably steady considering I was approximately 3 seconds from throwing the trifle at his head. Before I could elaborate on the many ways he'd cocked this up, James slapped me. Properly slapped me. Right across the face, in front of God and everybody in Mum's good china. Then, because why stop at simple assault when you can really commit to the bit? He shoved me towards the door and hissed, "Get out, loser." Loser. Me. The one with the actual doctorate and a career that doesn't involve scamming people. Everyone froze. The room went silent except for the grandfather clock ticking away in the corner, probably judging us all. But I stayed calm. Eerily calm. Because whilst my dear brother was busy congratulating himself on his criminal masterpiece, he missed one tiny, insignificant detail. The property was locked tighter than Fort Knox under federal conservation laws. Whoops. The next morning, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree on steroids. 25 missed calls in 30 minutes. His voicemail, and oh, how I've treasured that voicemail, was shaking with barely contained panic. They caught me. I leaned back in my chair, coffee in hand, and replied with all the warmth of a midwinter North Sea. Too late, loser. What he didn't know, what none of them knew really, because they'd never bothered to ask, was that I'd spent the last year and a half setting the perfect legal trap. And now it was snapping shut with the satisfying click of inevitability. Want to know how his scheme unraveled? Buckle up, darlings. This is where it gets properly entertaining. Looking back, 18 months earlier explains why I maintained my composure during that disastrous dinner, whilst everyone else lost their collective minds. You see, my family had been pressuring me for years, to mortgage Granddad's property to fund their real estate ventures. Because apparently, a pristine piece of protected coastland is just crying out to be turned into luxury condos for tech millionaires with more money than sense. James led the charge, naturally, always banging on about wasted potential and prime coastal development opportunities. I refused every single time, patiently explaining that federal easements protected it as critical marine habitat for endangered whales. But did he listen? Did he bollocks? The pressure intensified after his investments went spectacularly wrong. Cryptocurrency, because of course he jumped on that bandwagon right before it drove off a cliff. Then a failed gastropub venture in downtown Seattle that somehow managed to serve both overpriced food and terrible coffee simultaneously. Quite the achievement, really. He racked up debts faster than I accumulate research data, which is saying something. Dad and Mum covered some of his losses, enabling him, as usual, but he needed more. Always more. Just sign the mortgage papers, he demanded during one particularly tedious visit to Seattle. It's family helping family. Ah yes, family. That magical word people use when they want something from you, but haven't got the decency to offer anything in return. I saw his desperation. I also saw an opportunity. So I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with a manipulative sibling attempting property fraud. I pretended to agree while simultaneously setting up an elaborate legal trap. As you do, I told him I consider a preliminary contract with investors he knew. In reality, I contacted my old university mate, Olivia Chun, a real estate solicitor based in Seattle, with a particular fondness for shutting down dodgy property schemes. She's brilliant, ruthless, and has precisely zero tolerance for nonsense, my kind of person. Olivia reviewed the documents and confirmed what I already knew. The easements made any mortgage or development deal illegal without federal approval. Not just inadvisable, not just complicated, proper illegal. The kind of illegal that makes regulatory agencies very interested and very angry. This could be a setup, Olivia advised over coffee, her eyes gleaming with the particular excitement lawyers get when they smell incoming billable hours. If he forges anything, we reported immediately to prevent escalation. We drafted a plan where I gave vague verbal consent, but never signed official papers. Nothing in writing, nothing binding, just enough rope for James to hang himself with, metaphorically speaking. Olivia prepared reports for environmental agencies, ready to file the moment he crossed the line. My brother, bless his greedy little heart, jumped at my fake compliance. Thought he'd won. Started contacting investors, promising quick returns on coastal property he didn't own and couldn't legally develop. I documented everything. Every text, every email, every absolutely incriminating voicemail. Forwarded copies to Olivia like I was collecting Pokemon cards, except instead of Charizards, I was gathering evidence of fraud. Meanwhile, I strengthened the property's protections by submitting new data on whale migration patterns to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Gray whales specifically, majestic creatures. Also, as it turns out, incredibly useful for preventing property development when they're designated as endangered species requiring federal protection. The service loved my research, added stricter designations to the property, made any unauthorized deal not just illegal, but potentially criminal. You know, just in case James wasn't going to cock this up badly enough on his own. As my main research trip to Maine approached, I knew he'd act whilst I was gone. Olivia agreed to monitor the property records remotely, which is precisely as thrilling as it sounds, but infinitely more useful. If he files a fraudulent mortgage or contract, she said, we'll catch it early and alert the authorities. The easements weren't just bureaucratic paperwork. They were my weapon. Granddad had enrolled the property decades ago for tax benefits. Clever man. But in doing so, he'd locked it into perpetual conservation. No development. No mortgages. No escape clause. Just pure, beautiful, legally binding protection. I left for Maine confident that James's scheme would backfire through legal channels alone. All I had to do was wait. And document. And wait some more. Patience, I've discovered, is both a virtue and a spectator sport. The pressure from James didn't start recently. Oh no, this delightful dysfunction has deep roots, like a particularly nasty invasive plant species choking out everything decent. Growing up in suburban Seattle, our family worshipped at the altar of property development. Dad built the business buying up land to convert into condos or shopping centers. The kind of soulless developments that make urban planners weep and architects contemplate career changes. Mum handled paperwork and client meetings, raising us to value money and success above trivial things like ethics, happiness, or basic human decency. My older brother James fit right in from the start. Helped Dad with open houses as a teenager. Joined the firm full-time straight out of university. Thrived on closing deals, constantly droning on about market trends and investment returns with the passionate intensity most people reserve for actually interesting topics. My younger brother Thomas followed suit, studying business management and interning with them during summers, presumably whilst his soul slowly withered. But I was different. Always have been. Spent weekends exploring beaches near Puget Sound, collecting shells, watching tide pools, actually enjoying nature rather than plotting how to destroy it for profit. My parents dismissed it as a phase, confidently predicting I'd grow out of it and get a real job. Real job. As if understanding marine ecosystems isn't real. As if my doctorate is somehow less valid than James's ability to convince people to buy overpriced flats. They mocked my interest in marine biology, called it playing with fish when I brought home books on ocean conservation. Family dinners turned into lectures about how my hobbies wouldn't pay the bills, which is hilarious considering I'm now the only one not facing potential criminal charges. But I digress. Look at James, Mum would say, her voice dripping with approval. He's already making commissions. Dad would nod sagely, adding, we need practical skills in this family. Practical skills. Like fraud, apparently. After secondary school, I pursued a degree in marine science. They tolerated it the way you'd tolerate a peculiar rash, with mild disgust, and hope it would clear up on its own. Holidays brought arguments about my impractical choices, with James rolling his eyes so hard I'm surprised they didn't fall out, and Thomas staying diplomatically quiet while simultaneously judging me. I volunteered at local aquariums, learning about coastal ecosystems. They saw it as time wasted. I saw it as the only thing keeping me sane in a family that measured worth in property portfolios. Then came the inheritance 7 years ago. Our grandparents passed away within months of each other, leaving their waterfront cottage in Washington to me specifically. Not James, not Thomas, not the family. Me, just me. The place bordered Olympic National Park with direct access to protected coastal areas. Pristine, beautiful, absolutely perfect for marine research. My family was apoplectic with rage, having expected to sell it and split the proceeds like proper capitalists. It's prime land, James argued at the reading of the will, his face turning an interesting shade of purple. We could develop it into holiday rentals. Holiday rentals. Because what the world truly needs is more Arabs destroying local housing markets and annoying permanent residents. I visited the cottage and fell in love immediately, remembering how Granddad taught me to identify sea stars and monitor kelp forests. He'd always emphasized preserving the coastline, protecting it for future generations. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. While settling the estate, I discovered the federal easements on the property. Buried in the deeds were agreements from decades ago, enrolling the land in perpetual conservation programs in exchange for tax breaks. Granddad had restricted any development to keep it as habitat for endangered whales migrating through the waters. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had designated it critical for species like gray whales. Any changes required federal review. This meant no mortgages or contracts without agency approval. Attempting either would violate environmental laws. Proper, serious, go-to-prison environmental laws. I kept quiet about the easements initially, knowing my family would fight them. Over time, I submitted more research data on whale sightings, strengthening the protections. Added observation equipment near the shore, documented migration patterns for official reports. Built an absolutely impenetrable legal fortress around the property, brick by bureaucratic brick. James's troubles escalated about 3 years ago. His side investments crashed spectacularly. First, cryptocurrency rode that wave straight into the rocks. Then a boutique cafe he opened that closed after 6 months due to, and I quote from the bankruptcy filing, catastrophically poor business decisions. Racked up debts that would make a small nation nervous. Our parents bailed him out partially because enabling dysfunction is apparently the family business. But he needed more. Let me arrange a mortgage on the cottage, he pressed during one visit, his desperation showing. It's sitting there unused whilst I'm drowning. Unused. As if protecting endangered species habitat counts as unused. The man's a poet. I refused outright, citing maintenance costs and my own attachment to the place. But he kept pushing, suggesting preliminary contracts with his investor contacts. Family meetings turned tense, with Dad backing him up, shocking absolutely no one, and Mom adding guilt-laden comments about thinking of your brother. Thomas tried mediating, but ultimately sided with them, because of course he did. Standing up to the family would require a spine, which apparently wasn't included in his genetic package. I stood firm, knowing the easements made James's plans legally impossible. As his desperation grew, I suspected he'd try something spectacularly stupid, especially with my long research trip to Maine approaching. He started networking with developers, hinting at access to the property he didn't have, making promises he couldn't keep. And I let him. Watched him dig his own grave with a smile on my face and detailed documentation in my files. James's attempts didn't stop with awkward family visits. They escalated as his debts mounted higher, like a particularly aggressive game of financial Jenga, where he was both building the tower and knocking it down simultaneously. He began ringing daily, leaving voicemails about how the mortgage could clear his slate. I deleted most without responding, focusing instead on my actual work, contributing to human knowledge rather than contemplating property fraud. One evening, he appeared at my flat with a stack of forms from his investors, insisting I review them immediately. "It's just a preliminary step," he said, with the sincerity of a used car salesman on commission. I scanned the documents, absolutely riddled with legal problems, and handed them back, stating firmly I wouldn't sign anything. He accused me of hoarding the property out of spite, which is rich coming from someone actively attempting theft, but projection is a family trait. I explained, once again, that I was ouring Granddad's wishes. The conversation ended with him slamming the door and vowing to find another way, which I interpreted as commit fraud more creatively. To safeguard the site further, I ordered specialized equipment for my marine studies. Underwater sensors for current patterns, acoustic recorders for whale sounds. Setting them up required coordination with local conservation groups who helped position everything without disturbing the habitat. The installation took weeks. Multiple trips to the cottage, testing connections, calibrating data logs. I also consulted technicians for secure remote access, ensuring I could monitor everything from anywhere. Because if you're going to catch someone committing fraud, you might as well have video evidence, preferably in 4K. Dad pulled me aside during a family barbecue, attempting the reasonable father approach, which was hilarious given his track record. "James is in over his head," he confided, as if this was news. "Couldn't you reconsider?" Mom overheard and joined in, deploying the classic, "a little flexibility could save his business" guilt trip. Thomas watched from afar, not intervening, maintaining his speciality of being utterly useless in conflicts. I reiterated my stance, mentioning the easements in passing. They waved it off as minor hurdles, because federal law is apparently just a suggestion when profit's involved. James's investments continued failing. His latest venture, a property flip in downtown Seattle, collapsed when buyers backed out after discovering the building had structural issues he'd forgotten to disclose. Creditors started ringing his office. He turned to me again, because apparently I'm the family ATM. One signature, he pleaded over lunch, with the desperate energy of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. I refused once more, citing the legal complications. He left frustrated. I sensed him plotting something catastrophically stupid. With the main project looming, I scheduled a meeting with Olivia at her office. She examined recent title searches and noted unusual activity from James's contacts. Preliminary inquiries, value assessments, the kind of groundwork that precedes spectacularly bad decisions. "We should reinforce your position," she recommended, which is lawyer speak for, "let's make absolutely certain he can't wriggle out of this." She drafted notices to send to potential lenders, warning of the easements and potential violations. If anyone proceeded without approval, we'd report them to proper authorities immediately. Olivia also advised updating my insurance to cover unauthorized access. "This protects against claims," she noted, which sounded boring, but was actually rather brilliant strategic planning. We discussed contingency plans for quick legal action. Olivia had everything prepared, reports, documentation, contact details for environmental agencies. It was beautiful in its thoroughness, like watching a master craftsperson at work, except the craft was preventing property fraud. As departure neared, James made a last-ditch effort at Mom's birthday dinner. "Let me connect you with my investors," he offered, with the subtle pressure of someone who's bet everything on red and is watching the roulette wheel spin. I declined politely, explaining the restrictions again. He rolled his eyes, shocker, but I caught him exchanging significant glances with Dad. The kind of glances that mean we're definitely going to ignore everything he just said and proceed anyway. Perfect. Before flying out, I met Olivia once more to transfer monitoring access. She took detailed notes on the property setup and promised regular checks. "Any sign of improper filings, I'll alert the agencies immediately," she assured me. The 18-month assignment in Maine involved daily fieldwork on erosion sites. Absolutely riveting stuff, truly. Nothing says excitement like measuring sediment displacement. But I kept tabs through secure apps. Olivia's updates came steadily, confirming quiet at first. Then subtle signs emerged. Queries from lenders tied to James's network. Property value assessments. Survey requests. I prepared for the inevitable, knowing the easements would block any move. All I needed was patience and documentation. And perhaps a bit of popcorn, because this was about to get entertaining. 2 days after that disastrous family dinner, where James announced he'd sold property he didn't own, bold strategy, really, I drove to the cottage in Washington to assess the damage firsthand. The journey from Seattle took several hours, giving me ample time to contemplate my family's stunning capacity for self-destruction. When I arrived, yellow survey flags dotted the shoreline near the property line like some sort of demented garden party decoration. They marked spots for potential docks or expansions, clearly from investors scouting the site. My property, that they had no right to access, that James had no authority to sell. I pulled out my phone and documented everything. Photographed every flag, noting positions relative to easement boundaries. Documented tire tracks from recent vehicles. Collected business cards left by the survey crew, because apparently they were thick enough to leave evidence lying about. Back in the car, I rang Olivia and described what I'd found. She listened quietly. Lawyers are excellent at that, before responding that it matched the lender queries she'd flagged. "This confirms unauthorized activity," she said, and I could practically hear her smile through the phone. Without delay, Olivia contacted the local police, filing a report for suspected property fraud. She included copies of the easements and my ownership documents, emphasizing the federal protections. The officers took it seriously. Environmental violations make authorities very twitchy, promising to investigate the survey company's involvement. By afternoon, Olivia forwarded confirmation that the report was logged with referrals to state real estate regulators. She also notified the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about potential easement breaches, because if you're going to destroy someone's fraudulent scheme, you might as well be thorough about it. The investors, a couple from Portland looking for coastal property to flip, soon realized the deal was absolute bollocks. Their solicitor reached out to Olivia after discovering the preliminary contract James had pushed lacked my signature. Rather important detail that signatures generally being legally necessary for valid contracts. They demanded explanations. James stalled, presumably whilst panicking internally. They filed a civil lawsuit for misrepresentation and breach of contract. The suit sought damages for their time and expenses, plus punitive fees to deter future scams. They attached evidence of James's promises, emails, meeting notes, voice recordings. Everything beautifully documented, professionally presented, absolutely damning. James's phone started ringing constantly. Creditors, investors, solicitors, the kind of phone activity that signals your life falling apart in real time. He left frantic messages for Dad and Mom, but they couldn't help much. Turns out, enabling your son's fraudulent behavior doesn't actually protect him from legal consequences. Who knew? The lawsuit papers arrived at his office the following week, listing me as a witness. Olivia advised providing an affidavit detailing the easements and his unauthorized actions. I complied, sticking to facts without emotion. Just dry, boring, legally bulletproof facts. The most devastating kind. As the case built, James's business partners distanced themselves faster than rats, abandoning a sinking ship. Joint ventures canceled. Referrals withdrawn. The real estate community is surprisingly small, and news travels fast. One evening, my phone buzzed with his number. I let it go to voicemail initially, but curiosity won. His voice cracked as he spoke. They caught me. He begged me to vouch that I'd approve the contract verbally. As if verbal contracts mean anything when federal environmental law is involved. The desperation was almost pitiable. Almost. I texted back 3 words, "Too late, loser." The message felt final, cutting off his pleas. Petty? Perhaps. Satisfying? Absolutely. Olivia updated me that police had interviewed the survey crew, who admitted working on James's referral without verifying ownership. Because due diligence is apparently optional when you're committing fraud. Regulators opened their own investigation into his license status. The investor's suit gained traction with a court date set for preliminary hearings. James tried rallying the family, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. Interesting euphemism for fraud, but Thomas expressed doubts after reviewing the documentation. Dad attempted negotiating with the investors privately, offering settlements from his own funds. They refused, wanting full accountability. Quite right, too. Mom worried about publicity affecting their business networks because reputation damage is apparently worse than your son committing fraud. Priorities. Through it all, I stayed detached, letting the process unfold like a particularly satisfying slow-motion car crash. Olivia handled my side, ensuring my statement supported the facts. The easements held strong, blocking any claims on the property. As word spread through Seattle's real estate circles, James's reputation imploded. Clients pulled out of deals. Colleagues avoided him at industry events. Online reviews mentioned the ongoing dispute. Professional death by 1,000 cuts. A week after the lawsuit filing, Dad texted requesting an urgent family meeting. I arrived at their Seattle home to find everyone assembled in the living room like some sort of dysfunctional tribunal. Mom sat twisting her hands. Thomas paced by the window. James looked absolutely knackered, with puffy eyes from stress and probably inadequate sleep brought on by impending legal doom. Dad started immediately, explaining they'd heard from the investor's solicitor demanding settlement. "We can fix this together," he said, with the kind of determined optimism usually reserved for people who haven't grasped the severity of the situation. Mom chimed in about news spreading amongst their clients. Reputation damage. Business consequences. The usual concerns of people who value appearance over ethics. James cut to the chase, admitting he'd pushed the contract too far. Understatement of the century that, and urged me to tell everyone I'd been okay with it. I shook my head, reminding them the easements made it legally impossible. Not difficult, not complicated, impossible. Thomas suggested a family mediator, as if mediation could somehow alter federal law. Adorable. Dad offered to pay part of the damages from his savings if I withdrew as a witness. "It's about family unity," he pressed, deploying the classic guilt trip. Mom nodded vigorously, saying the business couldn't survive the scandal. James promised to cut ties with the investors if I helped smooth things over, as if smoothing over fraud was a reasonable request. I listened as they outlined plans to counter the claims, their desperation almost impressive in its scope. Olivia had warned me about this kind of pressure, so I rang her on speaker. She joined the conversation remotely, outlining the suit's progress with professional detachment. "The court has scheduled depositions," she explained, recommending I stick to the process. "Withdrawing now could raise suspicions." She detailed the investor's demands, full reimbursement plus legal fees. Standard for misrepresentation cases. Dad argued it was excessive. Olivia countered that property fraud carried standard penalties, regardless of family feelings about fairness. I agreed with her assessment, stating I wouldn't interfere. James grew agitated, accusing me of enjoying the fallout, which was partially accurate, but beside the point. Mom tried calming him. The room tensed further. Thomas asked about compromise, Perhaps a partial statement? Olivia advised against it. Half measures could complicate your position, she said, which is lawyer speak for don't be stupid. She detailed potential outcomes, including asset freezes if the case was ignored. Fun stuff. I ended the call and faced them directly, refusing to budge. This started with unauthorized actions, I said. The consequences are equally unauthorized by me. The meeting dragged on with more pleas, more guilt trips, more desperate negotiations. I held firm, which apparently made me the villain in their narrative. Fascinating how that works. By evening, James received notice of the first hearing date. His phone pinged constantly with emails from partners questioning his ethics. One major client canceled a project, citing the ongoing dispute. Dad's firm lost a referral network contact who'd heard about the case through industry channels. Small world, commercial real estate. Even smaller when you commit fraud. Mom mentioned neighbors whispering at their club events. Social death by gossip, her worst nightmare realized. James's social media filled with subtle unfollows from professional connections. The modern equivalent of being socially ostracized, except trackable through metrics. The local real estate association launched a review of his practices, threatening suspension. Professional organizations tend to frown upon fraud. Unreasonable of them, really. As the suit advanced, witnesses from a survey team submitted statements confirming James's instructions. The investor solicitor pushed for discovery, uncovering his financial records. Every fraudulent promise, every dodgy dealing, laid bare for legal scrutiny. James's attempts to settle privately failed when investors insisted on public acknowledgement. They wanted everyone to know what he'd done, which seems fair given he'd attempted to steal $500,000 through property fraud. Family friends stopped inviting them to gatherings, wary of association. Dad's deal slowed as lenders hesitated. Mom avoided her usual social circles, embarrassed by gossip. Thomas's internship offers dried up due to the family name now being associated with fraud. Collateral damage. Rather unfortunate for him, being guilty only of general uselessness rather than actual crime. James faced mounting bills from his own solicitor, dipping into whatever savings remained after his spectacularly bad investment decisions. The court granted a motion for summary judgment on key points, favoring the investors. Media outlets picked up the story as a cautionary tale in Seattle Business News. Local developer attempts property fraud, fails spectacularly. Not the headline he was hoping for, I imagine. James's license came under formal scrutiny with hearings scheduled. The family's reputation suffered irreversible damage in their tight-knit community. Creditors tightened terms on existing loans, adding financial strain. The dominoes fell beautifully, one after another, exactly as I'd anticipated. 3 months after the initial court motions, the judge delivered the verdict against James. The investors won on all counts, with the ruling highlighting his deliberate misrepresentation of the property status. He had to pay back their full advance plus interest, over £200,000 in restitution. The court also imposed additional fines for violating state real estate regulations, draining what remained of his accounts. James appealed immediately. Of course he did, but his solicitor warned the chances were slim given the evidence stack resembling Mount Everest. In the meantime, he liquidated personal assets, sold his car, downsized his flat. The kind of financial dismantling that happens when you gamble everything on fraud and lose spectacularly. The Real Estate Association revoked his professional certification after their review, barring him from practicing for 5 years minimum. Professional exile. Career death. Rather permanent consequences for temporary greed. Former colleagues stopped returning his calls. Job applications went unanswered as word circulated. One investor posted a detailed review on industry forums without naming him directly, but leaving enough clues for insiders to connect the dots. James's social circle shrank overnight. Invitations to networking events vanished. He spent evenings alone, presumably contemplating where exactly everything went wrong. Hint, it was the fraud. Dad's firm felt the ripple effects immediately. Longtime partners hesitated on joint projects, citing liability concerns. One major contract collapsed when the client referenced the case in their withdrawal letter. Revenue dipped 30% that quarter. Dad laid off staff, cut bonuses. The business he'd built over decades crumbling because he'd enabled his son's criminal behavior. Consequences, they're not just for other people. Mom's community groups whispered behind her back. She stepped down from a board position to avoid awkward questions, her social standing demolished by association. Thomas's career stalled completely. Recruiters pulled offers after background checks flagged the family connection. Rather unfortunate, being professionally ruined by proximity to fraud you didn't commit. The once closed family unit now met rarely. Conversations strained by unspoken blame and spoken recriminations. They'd imploded spectacularly, and I had a front row seat to the wreckage. I watched from afar, receiving updates through public records rather than direct contact. Professional distance, emotional detachment, possibly a touch of schadenfreude, though I'd never admit it publicly. Olivia handled the final witness confirmations, ensuring my affidavit stood unchallenged. With the case closed, I blocked their numbers one by one, starting with James. No more pleas. No more accusations. No more desperate attempts to make their problems my responsibility. I relocated my base to a small rental near the Maine coast, diving deeper into erosion studies without family distractions. Weekends brought solo hikes along protected shores where I analyzed data undisturbed. Professional networks expanded as I presented findings at conferences free from family ties pulling me back. My career flourished whilst theirs imploded. Poetic justice, really. The cottage in Washington remained secure, its easements intact against future threats. Conservation groups praised the outcome, using it as a case study in their workshops. How federal environmental law prevented property fraud. Makes a catchy title, doesn't it? Protecting personal boundaries meant saying no without guilt, even to blood relatives. Valuing the environment taught me resilience, turning potential loss into lasting strength. And destroying my family's fraudulent scheme? Well, that was just good old-fashioned schadenfreude with a legal twist. Looking back now, from my comfortable position of professional success and family estrangement, I can honestly say I regret nothing. Well, perhaps I regret that family dinner. The roast was overcooked, but the legal consequences? Those I embrace fully. My family taught me valuable lessons, though not the ones they intended. They showed me that blood relation doesn't excuse criminal behavior, that enabling dysfunction perpetuates it, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is let them face the consequences of their actions, preferably involving federal prosecutors. James learned that property fraud is actually illegal, regardless of how desperately you need money. Revolutionary concept that Dad learned that enabling your children's worst impulses eventually destroys everything you've built. Rather expensive lesson in hindsight. Mom learned that social standing built on dodgy business practices crumbles quickly when exposed. Shocking. Thomas learned, well, actually I'm not sure Thomas learned anything beyond maybe I should have chosen a different family. Fair assessment, really. As for me, I learned that patience, documentation, and federal environmental law make a devastatingly effective combination when deployed against family members attempting fraud. I learned that protecting endangered whale habitat is both morally correct and tactically brilliant when preventing property theft. I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply letting the legal system function exactly as designed. The cottage still stands on the Washington coast, protected by easements that will outlast all of us. Gray whales still migrate through those waters. Blissfully unaware, they prevented a property development scheme. Granddad's legacy remains intact. Pristine coastland preserved for future generations, exactly as he intended. He'd be proud, I think, or at least amused by how spectacularly James cocked everything up. My research continues. The erosion studies in Maine led to publications, speaking engagements, consulting opportunities. My career thrives whilst my family's implodes. There's probably a metaphor there about building on solid foundations versus shifting sands, but I'll leave that for others to unpack. I don't speak to them anymore. No contact. No reconciliation attempts. They send the occasional guilt-laden email, usually around Christmas, because nothing says festive cheer like emotionally manipulative correspondence. But I've mastered the art of the delete button. Mom tried once, about 6 months after the verdict, sending a lengthy letter about healing family wounds and moving forward together. Lovely sentiments. Would have been more convincing if she'd acknowledged that the wounds were self-inflicted and the moving forward required actual accountability rather than just pretending nothing happened. I sent it back unopened. Rather satisfying that. Dad attempted the reasonable patriarch approach via email, suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss things like adults. I replied with a single sentence. Adults don't enable property fraud. Haven't heard from him since. Thomas reaches out occasionally, usually when he's had a few drinks, sending rambling texts about how the family's falling apart and can't we just forgive and forget? Forgive? Perhaps, eventually, when I'm old and sufficiently mellowed by age and medication. Forget? Not bloody likely. I've got the court documents filed alphabetically. As for James, radio silence. Complete and utter radio silence. Last I heard through the professional grapevine, because the real estate community loves gossip almost as much as they love commission. He's working retail somewhere in Portland. Manager at a phone shop, apparently. Quite the career trajectory, from property developer to explaining mobile tariffs to confused pensioners. The 5-year ban on practicing real estate means he won't return to the industry until he's 43, at which point his reputation will still be absolutely toxic. Professional exile tends to be permanent when you've committed fraud spectacular enough to make the local news. I occasionally wonder if he thinks about that dinner. The moment he stood up and announced he'd sold my property, so confident in his criminal genius. Does he lie awake at night contemplating where exactly it went wrong? Does he understand that the single point of failure was assuming I'd be either too stupid or too compliant to stop him? Probably not. Self-awareness doesn't seem to run in the family, apart from my genetic aberration. The year following the verdict involved tedious but necessary administrative work. Olivia and I spent months ensuring every aspect of the property's protection was absolutely bulletproof against future attempts. We updated the conservation easements with additional provisions, strengthened the language around unauthorized access, added clauses specifically prohibiting family members from claiming any interest in the property. That last bit was Olivia's suggestion. She's wonderfully thorough when it comes to preventing future legal headaches. Essentially, she explained over yet another coffee meeting, we're building a legal fortress so impregnable that even if your family somehow develops both intelligence and morals, they still couldn't touch it. So we're preparing for an impossibility? I asked. Exactly, but a well-documented impossibility. I love lawyers. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service expanded their monitoring program for the gray whales, citing my research data as instrumental in understanding migration patterns. They installed additional tracking equipment along the coast, effectively increasing federal oversight of the entire area. More federal oversight means more paperwork, more inspections, more bureaucratic red tape. Normally, people find this irritating. I find it absolutely delightful, because every additional layer of bureaucracy is another barrier against development. The conservation groups I'd worked with used the case as a teaching example in their workshops. How to protect ecologically sensitive property from family members attempting fraud. Quite a niche topic, really, but apparently there's demand. Turns out I'm not the only person with relatives who value money over ecosystems. Who knew? I presented at several conferences discussing both the marine research and the legal framework that protected it. The Q&A sessions inevitably devolved into people sharing their own family property horror stories, which was simultaneously depressing and validating. My brother tried to drill for oil on our grandmother's ranch, one woman shared during a session in Vancouver. My sister wanted to clear-cut timber on protected wetlands, another added. We formed an impromptu support group. People whose families don't understand conservation law should probably make t-shirts. The property itself became something of a minor landmark in environmental law circles. Law students study the case. Environmental lawyers reference it in briefs. I've accidentally become a footnote in legal textbooks, which wasn't on my career bingo card, but I'll take it. People often ask if I feel guilty about what happened to my family. Usually strangers at conferences who've had too much wine at the networking reception and feel entitled to probe into my emotional state. The answer is no. Unequivocally, absolutely, comprehensively no. Should I feel guilty? Perhaps if I subscribe to the notion that family loyalty supersedes law, ethics, and basic human decency. But I don't, so I shan't. They chose fraud. I chose documentation. We all live with our choices. Do I feel satisfaction watching their lives crumble? Yes, but that's different from causing the crumbling. I didn't make James attempt property fraud. He managed that entirely on his own. I simply declined to be complicit in his crime. Rather important distinction, that. A colleague once suggested I should work through my feelings about the family estrangement, possibly with professional help. I explained that my feelings were quite worked through already. I felt relieved, vindicated, and occasionally smug. That doesn't sound emotionally healthy, she said, concern evident in her voice. Neither is enabling criminal behavior, I countered. But here we are. She dropped the subject. The truth is, my life improved dramatically after cutting contact. Stress levels plummeted. Career productivity increased. Emotional well-being stabilized. Turns out not being constantly pressured by manipulative relatives is rather good for one's mental health. Revolutionary discovery that I sleep soundly at night, which apparently James does not, according to Thomas's drunken texts. Insomnia brought on by financial ruin and professional disgrace, presumably, almost makes me feel sympathy. Almost. The cottage remains my sanctuary. I visit several times a year, conducting research, maintaining equipment, watching whales migrate through protected waters. It's peaceful in a way my family home never was, free from the constant pressure to monetize everything. Granddad understood that some things are worth more than their market value. Shame his grandchildren didn't all inherit that particular bit of wisdom along with his property. At conferences and social gatherings, people dance around the questions they actually want to ask, couching them in polite euphemisms and concerned tones. Allow me to answer them directly, because I'm nothing if not efficient. Do you ever miss your family? No. I miss the idea of a functional family, perhaps, but I never actually had one. Missing something that never existed seems pointless. I miss good biscuits more than I miss my family, and I'm not even particularly fond of biscuits. Will you ever reconcile? Reconciliation requires mutual acknowledgement of wrongdoing, genuine apology, and changed behavior, none of which seem forthcoming. So no, probably not. They need to develop self-awareness, ethics, and humility. Quite a transformation for people who currently possess none of those qualities. Don't you feel lonely? I have colleagues, friends, professional networks. I have research that fascinates me, work that matters, a career that fulfills me. I have a cottage on protected coastland where I can watch whales migrate undisturbed by family drama. I have peace, quiet, and excellent documentation filing systems. Lonely? No. Selective? Absolutely. What if they apologize? Then I'd know they've suffered brain injuries requiring immediate medical attention, because that level of personality change suggests neurological trauma. But seriously, if they genuinely apologized, acknowledging what they did wrong, accepting responsibility without excuses, demonstrating understanding of the harm caused, I might consider accepting the apology. Doesn't mean I'd resume contact. Forgiveness doesn't require relationship restoration, despite what Hollywood suggests. Do you regret how it turned out? Only in the sense that I regret having the kind of family that makes these choices necessary. I don't regret protecting my property, upholding the law, or refusing to enable fraud. Those were correct decisions, regardless of consequences. I do occasionally regret that final text to James, "Too late, loser," not because it was wrong, but because it was petty. Satisfying, but petty. Could have taken a high road. Chose the low road instead. It had better scenery. Would you do anything differently? I'd have documented everything from the beginning rather than waiting until tensions escalated. More cameras. more recordings, more written correspondence. You can never have too much evidence when dealing with family members inclined toward fraud. Also, I'd have skipped that final family dinner entirely. The roast really was dreadful. For those of you still reading, and bless you for making it this far through my family's spectacular implosion, here are the practical takeaways. 1. Document everything. Cannot stress this enough. Every conversation, every text, every email, every dodgy suggestion from relatives with financial problems. Documentation is your shield, your sword, and your alibi when everything goes sideways. 2. Know your property rights. Actually read the deeds. Understand the easements. Know the restrictions. Legal protections only work if you know they exist. Ignorance isn't bliss, it's vulnerability. 3. Federal law trumps family pressure. Environmental regulations, conservation easements, endangered species protections. These aren't suggestions. They're law. Family members who ignore them face consequences, regardless of how desperately they need money. 4. Get a good lawyer. Olivia saved my property and possibly my sanity. Invest in quality legal representation before you need it desperately. Prevention is cheaper than cure, especially in property law. 5. Boundaries aren't negotiable. But where family is emotional manipulation, not a legal argument. You can love your relatives whilst refusing to participate in their crimes. These concepts aren't mutually exclusive. 6. Trust your instincts. When someone seems likely to do something spectacularly stupid, they probably are. Plan accordingly. Set traps if necessary. Watch them spring said traps with popcorn in hand. 7. Schadenfreude is natural. Watching people face consequences for their actions isn't cruel, it's justice. Enjoying it doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Possibly a slightly petty human, but human nonetheless. 8. Cut contact if necessary. Family relationships aren't mandatory. If they're toxic, manipulative, or actively criminal, you're allowed to walk away. Blood relation doesn't obligate you to tolerate abuse, fraud, or really terrible roast dinners. 9. Professional success is the best revenge. Thriving whilst they implode proves you made correct choices. Career advancement, financial stability, and emotional peace. These are far better outcomes than winning arguments at family dinners. 10. Protect what matters. Whether it's endangered whales, coastal ecosystems, or your own mental health, some things are worth fighting for. Don't compromise on values because relatives apply pressure. 5 years have passed since that disastrous dinner. 5 years since James announced he'd sold property he didn't own, triggering the cascade of consequences that destroyed my family's unity and reputation. Best 5 years of my life, honestly. My research expanded. Published 3 papers on coastal erosion patterns. Consulted for environmental agencies. Taught graduate seminars. Built a career I'm actually proud of. Free from family pressure to abandon it for something practical. The cottage stands secure. Its protection stronger than ever. Gray whales continue their migrations. Blissfully unaware, they're the reason my brother can't commit property fraud. The ecosystem thrives undisturbed by development. I've dated occasionally, marine biologists, mostly because who else understand the appeal of spending weeks studying sediment displacement? One relationship lasted 8 months before we realized we were both too committed to our research to commit to each other. Ended amicably. Still co-author papers together. Very mature. Friends ask if I'll ever make peace with my family. I explain that I'm already at peace with myself, my choices, my career, my life. Peace with my family would require them to change fundamentally, which seems unlikely given their track record. James finishes his professional band next year. 43 years old, attempting to restart a career he destroyed through fraud. The real estate community has long memories and comprehensive background check systems. His prospects are, to put it mildly, bollocks. Dad's business never recovered. Revenue stabilized eventually, but at a fraction of previous levels. He sold the firm last year to a larger company, retiring early not by choice but necessity. Karma's timing is impeccable. Mom's social standing remains diminished. She joined different clubs, moved to different circles, but the whispers follow. Small communities have long memories. Thomas works in accounting now, having given up on real estate entirely. Smart choice, really. Probably the only smart choice he's made. We don't speak, but I don't wish him ill. He was guilty of spinelessness rather than malice. Disappointing, but not criminal. Sometimes late at night at the cottage, I stand on the shore and watch the sunset over protected waters. I think about Granddad, who understood that preservation matters more than profit. I think about the whales migrating safely through habitat that almost became luxury developments. I think about how close it all came to disaster. And I smile because I won, not because my family lost. That's just collateral damage from their own choices. I won because the things worth protecting remained protected. The law worked exactly as designed. Justice, for once, prevailed over greed. The gray whales don't care about property values or family dynamics or legal battles. They simply swim through ancient migration routes, following patterns established over millennia. They're oblivious to the human drama that protected their habitat. Lucky them, really. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to participate in dysfunction. That saying no to family is allowed. That documentation beats manipulation. That federal environmental law is surprisingly effective when properly deployed. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Even if the good guy is a sarcastic marine biologist with family issues and a penchant for schadenfreude. Last month, I received an email from James. First contact in 5 years. Subject line, can we talk? Body text, 3 paragraphs of apology, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, explanation of changed perspective. Actually sounded genuine, which was concerning. Either he'd had a genuine epiphany or he needed something. With my family, always assumed the latter. I sat with the email for a week, rereading it occasionally, analyzing the language, searching for manipulation. Found none, which was somehow more unsettling than if I had. Olivia's advice. Proceed with extreme caution and excellent documentation. My therapist's advice. Yes, I finally got one. Shut up. Consider what you want from this interaction and whether it's achievable. My instinct's advice. Delete it and move on with your life. I'm still deciding. The thing about consequences is they're supposed to be permanent. James faced legal penalties, professional exile, financial ruin. These were appropriate responses to attempted property fraud. But 5 years is a long time. People change. Sometimes. Or they learn better manipulation techniques. Hard to tell. I haven't responded yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. Maybe I'll compose 17 different responses, save them as drafts, and eventually delete them all. Maybe I'll agree to coffee, armed with a recording device and Olivia on speed dial. Maybe I'll forgive him someday, when I'm old and sentimental and suffering from dementia. Or maybe I'll delete the email and watch whales migrate through protected waters, perfectly content with estrangement. Because here's the thing about family. They're only important if they treat you well. Blood relation doesn't grant special privileges to treat you poorly, commit crimes against you, or pressure you into enabling their dysfunction. Some stories have neat endings with reconciliation and healing. This isn't one of those stories. This is a story about a man who protected what mattered, documented everything, deployed federal environmental law as a weapon, and lived happily ever after in selective solitude with excellent professional boundaries. Not the ending Hollywood would choose. Not the ending self-help books recommend. But it's my ending, and I'm keeping it. The whales approve. Probably. Hard to tell with whales. And that, as they say, is that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have erosion data to analyze and family drama to continue ignoring. Cheers.